Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Geetanjali Shree's novel, Tomb of Sand, which was translated from the Hindi by Daisy Rockwell and published by Tilted Access Press. This book has received some international acclaim recently, especially because it won the International Booker not too long ago. But this book has been sitting on my shelf since I think last September, when I ordered it right when it was published, kind of out of the blue, because I was searching through Tilted Access Press's website, because they're a fantastic publisher, especially of Asian literatures in translation. And I saw this book, and it was a big book written by a woman, and it had everything that I like in novels. It has digressions, wordplay, folklore, a blending of reality and mythology, multiple narrators, etc. Right off the bat, as I was reading the description, it had everything that I usually love in a novel. And this is a big book. And if you watch this channel, you probably know of my fondness for large and unwieldy books. And I think that Tomb of Sand falls into the realm of maximalism in some interesting ways. And I'm using maximalism quite loosely here, as it doesn't really fit into the genre of, say, William T. Vollmann or Thomas Pynchon or even Eduardo Albinati, whom I recently reviewed. And in fact, while almost every review of Tomb of Sand talks about how long this book is, it really isn't even that long. I mean, it's 742 pages in this edition, but there's a lot of white spaces. And there's reason for that, by the way. I think the physical size of this book and the layout and all of that is very thematically appropriate. But it's more maximalist in the way that a lot of mythology is maximalist, in the way that texts like Beowulf, the Kalevala, and of course the Mahābhārata are. And I'll leave the Mahābhārata out because it's a very important source text for Tomb of Sand. But it's also maximalist in the way that authors who often draw from these kinds of texts are. Authors like Salman Rushdie, Italo Calvino, Borges, Sjón, etc. How they are often drawing from mythology, and therefore, even if their page count isn't maximalist, their worlds that they create are. Like all of those other texts that I just mentioned, Tomb of Sand is a book that is full of tons of different characters, some essential to the plot and others that just kind of pass on through. And a lot of the word count of Tomb of Sand is spent on these digressions, on these side plots that seem to veer the plot off course. It also has multiple narrators. But again, like in the epic poems that I was just talking about, it's in these digressions, in these side plots, that this book's charm really is found. Further, like the best myths, Thrymskvida in the Old Norse and the Poetic Edda really comes to mind, Tomb of Sand doesn't take itself too seriously. It's light and airy and funny. I mean, it's a comedy, even though it's about some very serious topics. And all of this maximalist storytelling creates this mythic world in which our characters are just that. Characters. They're the kinds of characters that you encounter in mythology. They are often types, and this book often veers quite closely, I think, to allegory or parable, and again, in the way that a lot of myths do. Occasionally, parts of their characters are very well-rounded, and occasionally parts of their character seem rather flat. We see this in the names, for instance. In Tomb of Sand, we have a character called Overseas Son, because, well, he lives overseas. We also have one of our main characters' name is Betty, whose name, if I understand correctly, just means daughter, because she's, well, Ma's daughter. And so I suspect that a lot of readers of this book may complain that some of the characters feel flat, or they feel like they aren't acting completely rationally, or they aren't developed enough. But I think that that is sort of beside the point in a lot of ways. Individual character isn't necessarily the main focus in mythology. Further, I think a lot of readers might find it frustrating that some of these characters just disappear for a few pages or a few hundred pages. But again, I think the world in which this book takes place and the story itself, storytelling is perhaps this book's main focus and its main character. Those things never stop developing. And all of this isn't to say that the characters in this book are flat in a negative way, by the way, but simply to point out that much of this book feels like it's much bigger or higher than reality, that it takes place on a higher plane than reality. It takes place in the world of the fantastic or the mythological. But, of course, this book is grounded in history, and so there is this constant tension and a constant union in this book between history and fiction, reality and mythology. What Tomb of Sand is, I think, is a mythological retelling of the history of the partition of India and the border that that act created, and thus also created the border people, those people who now found themselves on either side of this wholly manufactured border. For those who are unfamiliar with this history, I'll be incredibly brief here. When India gained its independence from Britain in 1947, it was split into two different dominions by the British, India and Pakistan. And it was essentially split right along religious boundaries. And this, of course, created a massive displacement of people and separated people solely based on religious lines. And it essentially drew arbitrary lines in the sand. And it was a complete disaster for the people living in this religion who now inhabited this kind of border zone, which quickly became a war zone. I'll come back to the history of partition at the end and talk a little bit about why I think it's mythologizing this history and why the translation of this book is so important. But I think we should probably get to Tomb of Sand now. This book has a magnificent opening that I think is definitely worth reading. A tale tells itself. It can be complete, but also incomplete, the way all tales are. This particular tale has a border and women who come and go as they please. Once you've got women and a border, a story can write itself. Even women on their own are enough. Women are stories in themselves, full of stirrings and whisperings that float on the wind, that bend with each blade of grass. The setting sun gathers fragments of tales and fashions them into glowing lanterns that hang suspended from clouds. These too will join our story. The story's path unfurls, not knowing where it will stop, tacking to the right and left, twisting and turning, allowing anything and everything to join in the narration. It will emerge from within a volcano, swelling silently as the past boils forth into the present, bringing steam, embers, and smoke. I love the first third or so of this book. It's told by these various narrators. Occasionally it's this disembodied first-person singular, and occasionally it's this disembodied first-person plural, but they kind of come and go at different times. The narrator often shifts, and this storyteller figure or figures is really central to this book, though it's often unclear who or what it is. But whatever they are, they command us at different times in this book. And I mean, you know I'm going to bring up Beowulf, but it really just reminds me so much of the narrator of Beowulf, which the first word of that poem is what, or listen. It's a call to listen. It's a command. In these sorts of stories, the narrator rarely allows themselves to fall back into the background. They rarely let us forget about them. And the role of the narrator, the storyteller, the historian is so important to Tomb of Sand. And what I found so interesting about the opening of this book, really the first 70 or so pages, is how aware of the storyteller we are forced to become. The narrators intervene and then digress and then apologize for that digression, which then leads to another digression. At one point, we just get a quick chapter that says, "Enough, let's get back. Although the tale has no need for a single stream, it is free to run, flow into rivers and lakes, into fresh new waters. But for now, we must insist on not straying. So for the time being, we simply won't. Let's return to where we began this story, to the land of the two women." The opening part of this book has just so many false starts, as our narrators really ease us into this story and into this world, as it feels like we're kind of walking into the ocean and the waves push us back on shore, but then another wave comes and brings us back out. And it's really this meditative ebb and flow that really eases us into this world. Anyways, I really like this. I do think a lot of readers will be very frustrated by the first third of this book. But for me, Shree's language and Rockwell's translation work best when things aren't moving. When the plot isn't moving, when the characters aren't moving, when they're all just kind of existing within the various tombs in which they exist. And speaking of not moving, at this book's opening, Ma, who is about 80 years old and more or less our central character, is laying in bed, refusing to get up. After the death of her husband, she has fallen into this deep depression, and her whole family is trying to coax her out of bed and trying to coax her back into everyday life. They're trying to bring her back out of her tomb of sorrow. And so in many ways, this book is very much a domestic novel, as it's really just about this grieving family trying to come back together after this great loss. But it's in this focus on family that Shree creates, well, a world. Because for Shree, the family is a world. It contains everything. Anything we say about the Mahābhārata could also be said about families. They contain all that exists in the world, and whatever they don't contain doesn't exist, not even in the imagination of a poet. That is, the gone-astray terrorist, the hot-headed leftist, the female and the feminist, the everythingist and the opti-pessimist, all in the family, or in the Mahābhārata, whichever you prefer. The world is in the Mahābhārata, the world is in the family, and thus the Mahābhārata is in the family, the daily flare-ups, each one a Mahābhārata. We see here this really interesting mythic connection as the basic domestic is put on the same level as the legendary, mythic, and cosmic history of the Mahābhārata. And really quick, I'm not sure if it's Mahābhārata or Mahābhārat. I've heard it pronounced both ways, so I apologize if I'm mispronouncing it. But I think this really gets to an interesting point, which is that while this book is very much about the history of the partition of India, obviously, for most of its page count, it isn't, at least not directly. Unlike, say, Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, where you can't help but be hyper aware of the way in which Rushdie is playing with political history, as it's all, well, a bit on the nose, to make a pun on Salim Sinai, the main character of that book. Shree seems much more interested in the ethereal or a specific history for most of this book. She's more interested in stories than in history, as it's storytellers, not historians, she argues, that tell us the capital T truth. Historians are always hypothesizing about which date which event occurred. They scurry about trying to classify events as major and minor. Who knows, they might get interested in researching which day Sid arrived to shower Granny with love and scolding. Before Rosie or after? Before KK or after? Before Ma fell or after? Before the hospital or after? Storytellers are 1,000 times better than historians. They describe whatever draws their interest, whether it's the small moments or the big. And with this in mind, it becomes quite clear quite quickly that this book really moves away from reality at different times into the realm of what might be called magical realism, though that label is often thrown too far from Latin America, where it developed. And I think that the word fabulism is probably more apt here. We're told in the opening of this book about Ma's magical cane, which comes into play at a few different moments. And so there are a lot of fabulous motifs and fabulous moments in this book. But we also get all of these sentient animals. Crows play a very major role in this book. And there's a moment that I particularly just adored, where we get this Parliament of Fowls, sort of Geoffrey Chaucer style, as all of these crows gather and they speak in all of their different crow languages and crow dialects, and they meditate on and argue about all of these different ideas. And I won't go into detail here, but I hope just this small note shows how playful Shree is, but how it's in this playfulness that there is, I think, something really profound. As Shree tries to capture in language multiplicity that extends even beyond the human. And along with this fabulism, there is this otherworldliness throughout this book that is really encapsulated, I think, in this book's main image, its main word, which is rendered into English by Rockwell as tomb, though the original Hindi word is samadhi. Again, pardon the pronunciation, but we get what that word means in the epigraph to this book. Samadhi. A state of deep meditation, a trance, the final stage of yoga. 2. Self-immolation of an ascetic by entombment. 3. Place of entombment, especially of a saintly personage, or one who has died heroically. And so this word, this image, occurs again and again and again to refer to a whole host of different things throughout this book. But I think the most powerful image that is invoked with this tomb is that of the storyteller as excavating this tomb. At one point, the narrator tells this very long story of Buddha and how he sort of encapsulated himself in a spiritual and meditative tomb of sand to, quote, escape the grievous cycle of rebirth and death. And then the narrator goes on to link this to a physical tomb of sand. But digging holes is holy, whether you are excavating or expiating. It gets out anything and everything. be they from sand or earth, water or air. Old bones and old tales take form through both digging and divinity. This is why it's difficult to bring progress to places like Israel and Italy, because as soon as you take out a spade to build some fresh new invention, centuries past start peeping through an ear or a nose, even the eye of Jesus, and the faith of the faithful is restored. This is what it's like in Sumer and Mesopotamia as well. No sooner do they reach down below the earth than old tales begin to rise from the tombs. The solution to this has been to hit them hard and fell them from above. Before the deities sunken deep in the earth can blink, they're already being demolished. But for Shree, all of this digging, all of this excavating results in meaning. Meaning, even if centuries erode them or beasts and birds nibble away at them, even if villainy is heaped upon villainy, these tales, these tombs, these samadhis, these idols, they just won't die, nor will they remain buried forever. They remain seated in an attitude of meditation, and slowly the sand dunes cover them, and they stay covered as long as they are meant to be. Personal, familial, cultural, national history are all entombed in these tombs. And what Shree seems to be suggesting is that while there is, of course, this very physical side to this, there's also something larger, more metaphysical to this. And that kind of excavation can only be done by the storyteller. And this is really what Shree is doing for the partition of India. She is taking this buried tomb full of all of these physical things like items and bodies, but also full of all of these intangible things like cultures and identities. And she's digging them all up and rebuilding them into a new tomb that we can all gaze upon, the tomb of sand. And she really just excavates this idea and plays with all of these different linguistic connotations of all of these different words. And I just love this little chapter as she is really just kind of riffing on all of these different ideas. And she connects it to the harmful ways that this has been done through colonialism. And while she's clearly condemning colonialism in a lot of ways, she's also just having so much fun with the language of all of this. The advent of the British brought the Anglo-angle into the treatment of such samadhis. Entombed skulls, bones, tales became items for display in museums, libraries, sitting rooms, offices. Speculators also set their prices. After tugging and digging and tugging out their stories, which activities they refer to as research, they go about calling themselves storytellers and historians. Egoism, that is to say, digging and deifying oneself, has wholly replaced the holy and set up shop. It's just so good. But speaking of these kind of etymological echoes and the language that Shree kind of dances around with, in Daisy Rockwell's translator's note at the end of this book, she talks about this concept of Diwani, which she argues is central to Shree's language. And Rockwell tries to translate this word and kind of give some context to it. And it's worth just reading this quickly. Diwani is an echo, a vibration, a resonance. It is alliteration and assonance. Diwani could be deliberate and playful, as is double entendre and punning, an accidental mishmash of sameness, or a mystical reverberation. Geetanjali often makes word choices that prioritize Diwani over dictionary meaning. Wordplay takes on a life of its own in many passages, and sometimes even drives the narrative. And this is really what this book is. The echo of history, the vibration of identities and cultures across time and place, the reverberation of story. More than that, though, it's about translation and the ways in which people carry themselves and their cultural and familial things and ideas across borders. In the final section of this novel, Ma invokes all of these partition authors, all of these authors who have since kind of written about this partition and the effects that it has had on them personally or on their larger culture. And she also invokes all of the people who have lived in this now border zone, who have been, again, affected by this border. And by invoking all of these storytellers and all of these people who have their own individual stories, she's really invoking all of the people and their identities and their cultures and their languages of pre-partition India. And what she's really doing is weaving them all together into a new mythology, dissolving the borders and blending back together all of these different people's cultures, ideas, languages. And by doing all of this, she is attempting to restore this area to its pre-partition state. This is all to say that this book mythologizes the partition of India in an attempt to not only restore what was lost or stolen or to rebuild that which was broken, but also to create something entirely new. Borders are not for Shree a thing that separates two things, but it is a place where two things meet, where they meet and they mix together and they grow into something new. Throughout Tomb of Sand, she focuses on all of these things which separate people: class, caste, gender, religion, language, culture. And she dissolves these borders, or at least makes them porous once again. So many of the characters in this book, especially the women characters, are constantly moving across these borders, and with them they carry things, people, ideas across these borders. That is, at the very heart of this book, I think, is translation. That is, in the Latin sense of the word translatio, to carry through or across. And that's one of the reasons why I think this book really deserved to win the International Booker. It's a beautiful translation of a book about translation. Not only is it about translation, though, of course, but it's about all of these different things: gender, class, history, mythology, post-humanism, etc. And it's really focused in on these perceived binaries, which in Shree's estimation aren't binaries at all, but fluid spectrums, but they are perceived as binaries. The binary between the genders, between human and animal, between fiction and non-fiction, between nations and religions, between history and mythology. Books are supposed to really focus in on like a theme or two, but Tomb of Sand really moves fluidly between all of these different themes. It attempts to be all-encompassing in some ways. And in that way, Tomb of Sand seems to be suggesting that the only reason for a border to really exist, again, is not to separate two things, but to allow someone to cross across that boundary. Borders for Shree are porous, not impervious. Border, Ma says? Border? Do you know what a border is? What is a border? It's something that surrounds an existence. It is a person's perimeter. No matter how large, no matter how small, the edge of a handkerchief, the border of a tablecloth, the embroidery around my shawl, the edges of the sky, the beds of flowers in this yard, the borders of fields, the parapet around this roof, a picture frame. Everything has a border. However, a border is not created to be removed. It is meant to illuminate both sides. You removed me. Should I leave? No. A border does not enclose. It opens out. It creates a shape. It adorns an edge. This side of the edging blossoms, as does that. Embroider the border with a shimmering vine. Stud it with precious stones. What is a border? It enhances a personality. It gives strength. It doesn't tear apart. A border increases recognition, where two sides meet and both flourish. A border ornaments their meeting. And it goes on, and it just ends with this amazing line: a border, gentlemen, is for crossing. This book is very much a mythologization of the partition of India. As we see these border lines drawn in the sand, and we think that, well, that's that. Now we have these two separate entities. But what we actually see is this line in the sand being blown away by the wind as people refuse to be separated and contained. In my opinion, Tomb of Sand is at its best when it's being playful, witty, and verbose. My favorite parts of the book was when it was just meditating on a single idea or riffing on a single word. That is to say that the plot was fine. I think the plot especially picks up in the last third of the book, where it is exceptionally done. But the moments where the book was just being playful and letting out this torrent of words and these etymological echoes, I think for me, that was what made this book the most worth reading, and that's kind of what I really cherish looking back on reading this book. Anyways, I think this is a good book, one that deserved to win the International Booker, as it in many ways embodies the very point of that prize. And Rockwell's translation, I think, is just a marvelous feat to witness. I mean, I don't know if all the wordplay is there in the original Hindi, because I don't read Hindi, but it's very much here in the English, and it's just an absolute joy to read. Tomb of Sand is a book that if you are interested in translated literature, you should absolutely pick up, though be prepared to be swept away to places that you didn't expect to be swept away to. That is, anyways, the point of what literature should do. But this is the world. It never lets up. The world is in dire need of literature, because literature is the source of hope and life. So the world finds a way to dissolve into literature via harum-scarum, hidden open paths. It quietly ends up soaked in the stuff. It tiptoes into literature. It seeks to erase its despair by reveling in unique ways of freeing itself from a world that literature employs, and succeeds when the tale of a dying woman evolves into a story about her thriving and flourishing, and Khyber causes a matchless, guileless love to blossom in full. The world gets stirred up, and out of the violence and revenge of Khyber, out of the hills, out of the glimmering of precious stones and sky, it gathers sunlight. Green patches of shoots and leaves greet the world amongst the rubble of destruction. That's why the world tiptoed happily into the love story for a time, but ultimately couldn't keep quiet for joy. Thanks for watching.